Thank you, everyone, for joining us on our second seminar of our FishCAST seminar series. My name is Dr. Tina Simoniuk. Most of you already know me. I am the director of FishCAST, which is a NSERC Create Fund program to train our wonderful trainees, the next generation scientists and practitioners in the aquatic sciences, both conservation and management. I am so privileged and fortunate to come to you today from the beautiful and sunny Wawaitanong. It's where the two rivers bend, also known as Windsor, and this is where FishCAST is primarily administered. And this is where our trainees are learning, not just Waitanang, but across Turtle Island in terms of reciprocal relationships and the value that we place with our Indigenous knowledge holders and our local knowledge holders as we learn in a circular fashion all about our connections between each other, to land, to water, and we're learning and we're unlearning. FishCAST here is administered in Windsor. And this is the part of the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, and they include the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. And again, I'm so privileged to be here and fortunate as a settler in these areas and these lands. I just wanted to reiterate again what our shared values are as we learn to decolonize our approach to science, to our approach to practicing, and when we're growing capacity and our ability to address systemic barriers that we face in our field, and to work collaboratively to overcome them as part of our shared history, our shared future together as treaty land inhabitants. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our introducer. It's very meta, but I'd like to introduce you to our trainee, Albana Berberi, who will be making the introductions for our guest seminar speaker today. So without further ado, Albana, please take the floor.
Thanks, Tina. Hi, bonjour, Annie. My name is Albana, as Tina said, and I'm a FishCAST trainee. I am doing a PhD at Carleton, supervised by Dr. Vivian Nguyen and Dr. Steve Cook. And thank you all for joining us today for our FishCAST seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker, Dr. Katie Stammler. Dr. Stammler completed her Bachelor's of Science in 2003 at the University of Windsor and her Master's of Science in 2005 at the University of Guelph, where she studied fish assemblages in agricultural drains. She completed her PhD at the University of Western Ontario in 2011, where she examined the extent, characteristics, and effects of stream burial in southwestern Ontario. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo from 2011 to 2014, studying long-term trends in stream water quality across all land use types. She has been with the Essex Regions Conservation Authority as the water quality scientist and source water protection project manager since 2014. Katie's career came full circle when she became an adjunct associate professor at GLEAR, the Great Lakes Institute of Environmental Research, in 2020, and she is currently trying her hand at being a sessional lecturer for the School of Environment. Locally raised in Windsor, Katie is passionate about making a difference in our corner of the world through research, conservation, education, and mentoring the next generation of conservationists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katie Stammler.
Thanks, Albana. I don't have to give my presentation. I forgot I wrote such a thorough bio. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. You can just let me know if I end up sharing the correct screen. It might also be a little bit meta at first while I get to the right spot. Oh. Don't have a million things open on your screen, right? Is the other. Nope. I'm going to stop.
I love all the presentations you're working on. We might have actually lost. Yeah, there she goes.
I'm having a day. I'm having a day. I tried to stop sharing and instead I hung up. I'm only on one screen, so that's my I'm gonna blame that. should have sent you my presentation. That would be easier.
But then who knows what would have happened next, right?
That's true. That's true. Okay.
Nice.
Here we go. Maybe. Haha.
Lovely. Looks
Okay, I've done
great.
it. Woo! Oh, and you even get to see my screen captions because now I don't know how to make them go away. So thanks for having me. I called this talk Doing, Using, and Communicating Science Beyond the Ivory Tower. And I'm happy to be talking to you guys here for FishCAST. So I want to start a little bit about my early life. And, I was sort of thinking, how am I going to talk to you guys about communication and how I got to where I am. And part of that early life was dancing on stage at a very young age. I was maybe 5 or 6 when I started dancing. I was never a competitive dancer. My mom likes to say I always danced to the beat of my own drum. So I'm not sure if I ever did what I was supposed to be doing, but I was up there. And really, it helps you with your poise and getting used to that idea of looking out at an audience and knowing they're all watching you, but maybe they're not really paying attention. So I think that had more of an influence than you imagine when you're doing it at the time. When I was a kid, we did speeches. We wrote them on cue cards. We didn't have presentations. So you would have a topic area that you had to write a speech on, and we would research it with books, not the internet. And you would sit down with your parents who would maybe help you figure it out. And then we would write our speeches. Um, and I often was very nervous doing those, and I never really felt like I did a very good job. To the effect that one time I ran for student council and I gave a presentation about, what I would do as if I was elected student council. And I did such a bad job that I didn't vote for myself when it came time to vote for the student elections because I didn't believe that I had done a good enough job. I had a lot of really amazing influences in my early life as well when it comes to public speaking and being in front of people. Beginning with my 2 older siblings, my sister won numerous speech contests. My brother was always, he was a little bit quieter, but he was also strong in his words and willing to stand up in front of people. My grandma was a force to be reckoned with. She never was afraid to speak up and use her voice for anything that she needed to. At 96, she had a lot of influence in her life and on a lot of different people. So she certainly taught me how to be bold and how to be brave. My dad was definitely one of my biggest influences. He had gone to St. Clair College in an engineering program, and he worked his way up in General Motors until he was in management. And it was interesting because it was much later on, probably during my PhD, that he and I talked about imposter syndrome. And he didn't know it had a name. I didn't know it had a name, but we both knew that at some point we felt like we didn't deserve to be where we were. So it was really a cool thing to share with him. The other thing that he did was that once he sort of, got himself through that, he believed that he could do almost anything if he faked it hard enough. So he did a lot of, he was the leader of his band, but he couldn't play an instrument, so he marched with the baton. He was the president of the Windsor Symphony, which also had a huge influence on my young life growing up, going to symphonies with him. And that meant that he had to stand in front of the entire audience and open up the show and welcome them. And he did that for over a decade. So really had a big influence in seeing that he was brave and could stand up in front of those people. And not to be not least, absolutely not least, is my mom. She just turned 75. And she is incredibly strong and incredibly brave, but doesn't always believe that she is those things. She was a Sunday school teacher, so was always sort of speaking. She was the kid, I was the kid that if something was wrong at school and people were mad about it, they'd say, call your mom so she can come and do something about it. She's also my biggest cheerleader, and you will hear more about my mom in this presentation. She's been a part of everything that I've done. So as I said, I did my my undergraduate degree at the University of Windsor. So here where I'm actually sitting in Memorial Hall right now on campus. I did a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Biology with co-op, and I believe the program doesn't necessarily exist anymore. And was very, you know, I mean, everything that I learned in terms of my science comes from this background in this program. I did an undergraduate with the co-op. You have different jobs. So my first job was actually working for Linda Corkum, collecting up adult mayflies, sexing them, and identifying them. So learning how to tell a male from a female. So the female is the light creamy color, the male is the dark color. And then the species you can tell in the males by looking at the shape of their sex organs. And interestingly, even though this work is a whole 20 years ago that I did this, every single summer I'm telling people about mayflies and who's who and what they are, and listening to Linda talk about them. She was so passionate about mayflies, and you would hear her talking to the media, and she would say, when the moon hits the lake just right and the mayflies, you know, whatever. And she had this whole story that she would tell, and she was so excited about it. So it really stuck with me. And then I also did some work for the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority doing drain classification work. I did a stint at the International Joint Commission doing some work for them. And I also worked in a greenhouse, which was very physical labor, but ended up being really helpful for me at this point in my career to have a better understanding of how greenhouses operate, because we do a lot of work around trying to understand their impact on the environment. It's also when I really got introduced to benthic macroinvertebrates and fish, which then led to all of my graduate work. So I did do an honors thesis on round goby shelter selection. So it was a behavioral study. You know, when I was here at the university, you know, into the wee hours of the night, because we were doing nighttime and daytime experiments, and I would have friends come with me, and we'd count how many times they hit each other or ran away or whatever they were doing. And Linda helped me to publish this work, which was a really cool thing to have that out of my undergrad. So some standout moments and people I've mentioned Linda Corkum and Jan Zabrowski, who were incredibly influential for me in my early academic life. And then the photo on the bottom where we're in costume, that's from my PhD graduation. My actual graduation was in October, and I decided I needed to have a Hallow grad party, so everybody came wearing costumes. And Linda was there, even though, you know, it had been several years since I'd been in her lab. And then things came around full circle for me with Jan as I started having some involvement on student committees. I really turned to him to help me to be a good committee member and to you know that I was on the right track in terms of asking those questions. So these mentors that we have early on can really stick around for us. I also had a couple of really interesting standout comments that were made to me. So when I was presenting my honors thesis, I had forgotten this, but it came back to me recently. Somebody, and I can't remember which prof, said to me, "You did a really great job presenting your undergraduate thesis. I have no idea if what you said was right, but I believed every word of what you said." Oh, these sort of came in out of order. We also went through a change in technology during my undergraduate where I actually made overheads. So, you know, the actual cellophane overheads, and printed them out to having PowerPoint. So these shifts in technology were really fast. And the other thing that was said about me, and I believe it was Dr. Peter Sale that said this, for someone who's supposed to be so smart, she sure is stupid. And he said that because I forgot to apply for a scholarship, and then Linda had to plead my case. So, you know, some of these things stick with us as we move through our careers. And you know, again, touching on Linda and the influence that she was very open with her students and created this very welcoming atmosphere. And I remember sitting at my desk, and Linda was behind me sorting through a drawer, and she was getting herself a little bit frantic, and she stopped and she said, "Calm down, Linda. And it was just, just that really real connection to your mentor. At the University of Guelph, I did my master's in 2 quick years on agricultural drains as fish habitat, and actually made some recommendations from that about managing fish and drains under the Fisheries Act and the Drainage Act. And I also, that's when you start TAing and you start getting feedback from people, and you hear things like Katie is awesome and also Katie is the worst TA ever. So, you receive these 2 pieces of feedback, and you have to determine what you want to do with those, and how much you're going to let those negative pieces of feedback affect you versus helping you grow into being something even better. So going into communicating, it was really important in my master's that building relationships. So everything that I did was partnered with conservation authorities. So I was in um, every conservation authority, basically between Essex and the Grand. So getting to know the staff there, communicating with them about the sites that I selected, sitting down with drainage superintendents, trying to learn how to read drainage engineering documents. Um, Trying to understand how and why drainage worked, and starting to learn the importance of approaching things from multiple perspectives, and having, not just that science understanding, and knowing that when I was going to communicate my results, there was, I'm just a city girl who did some science work, and I'm not going to go stand in front of farmers and tell them what they can and cannot do. So I needed to have an understanding about why they made the decisions they did for drainage, the purpose that drainage had for them, as well as the purpose that drainage had for fish. So really trying to hone in on that idea of taking different perspectives. I attended my first conferences. I went to many conferences by myself, and I had very supportive master supervisors in Nick Mandrak and Rob McLaughlin. But often I was on my own at a lot of these things. I was at the Ontario chapter of the American Fisheries Society, where I gave a presentation, and I very nearly won the top prize, but Dave Zanata beat me out because he gave a presentation with videos of mussel lures on them. So I lost out to something cooler. This is also where I started to learn to meet the audience where they are. So because the work I was doing was in drains, I was giving presentations to the drainage superintendents of Ontario every year, um, and trying to explain to them what a multivariate stats graph looked like, and what that actually meant, and communicating that out. And I always got really good feedback and was requested to come back to present to that group every couple of years. And got interesting and hilarious comments because I move around a lot when I give presentations, that I should probably have a portable microphone when I give presentations. And then, starting to get into the publication realm and finding the right journal, striking that balance between science and management, because the work that I did needed to be communicated in a way that could be understood and utilized. So here's where I'm going to bring my mom back into things. So when I did my defense, I did my public. I'll dial back a second. So up until my master's, my mom read every document that I made, every paper that I wrote, and it drove me crazy because she would read every sentence over and over and over again, until it sounded right. So in my public presentation, one of my examiners heard my mom walk away and say, "Oh, that was so great. I understood everything that she said." And in my thesis, in my acknowledgments, I acknowledged my mom and dedicated it to her and thanked her for having read every draft of my thesis. And a large bulk of my questioning at my defense was around this idea of, why was it so important for you that your mom understands your thesis? And my mom was representative of who I wanted to read my thesis and who I wanted to read my work, because the work was meant for farmers and drainage superintendents and fisheries managers. So if my mom could understand it, it meant they could understand it. So it was a really interesting route that my defense ended up taking. And then when I was done my master's, I went on this crazy roadshow because the work was, very timely and needed to be talked about. So I was giving presentations at every conservation authority and everywhere that I could. And when I started my PhD, it kind of burnt me out that I did that. So that did end up taking a little bit of a toll, but it was a really cool experience. So I did my PhD at Western in environmental science, which was this really neat collaborative program. So I had my PhD is in biology, but then we also had this environmental science program that had people from geography and engineering and other sciences that were all interested in doing work around the environment. So rather than us sitting in a room full of people that did genetics work or physiology, which wasn't as meaningful and didn't necessarily get to the same point. We were sitting with other people who were studying the environment, and I studied specifically the extent of stream burial on the effects of downstream fish and benthic macroinvertebrates. So it led directly from my master's into this work, and I did bring a lot of my own contacts into that situation. My PhD was a tough time. I started in one lab where I spent about maybe 6 or 7 months in that lab. It turned out that it was a toxic environment, one that was not good for me. And I went through some difficult times in figuring out how to get out of that lab and into one that was a better fit for me, and found my home in Bob Bailey's lab, where the sort of work-life balance was very important. Not so much push on publishing, so I had a much better experience for myself in that lab, and really had to take stock of what was important to me. I also had a couple of health scares, so really was an opportunity for me to step back and say, this is the rest of my life, and I need to figure out what my priorities are and what's important. So yes, you're doing all this amazing graduate work, but you're also doing lots of other things while you're doing your PhD. This is the marathon. If your master's is a sprint, your PhD is the marathon. So, finding those opportunities to hang out with other students and do field courses. I had this really amazing opportunity to go to the Yukon to help one of my lab mates do some fish and benthic invertebrate work. That was all helicopter sampling. That was amazing. Finding, opportunities to have fun when you're in the field and doing silly things. I returned to dance at this point in my life. I started taking tap classes again and actually having recitals. I found salsa dancing, and spent a lot of time learning and doing that and just socializing with people. I also had my amazing cat, Riley, who studied for my comps with me in this ridiculous fish named Bubba. That, these are the things that stuck with me from my PhD. So, the people, not just the work, but the people are important at this point in your career. So in terms of communicating here, I had some established relationships that I brought with me, which was really cool. I definitely gave fewer presentations and had more opportunities for TAing. And I did a lot more service work at this point. So being student representatives on faculty committees and other organizations, joining professional groups, planning and actually executing conferences either on campus or some of the bigger conferences that I helped out with. And really, so that's Bob Bailey there on the left, and my lab mate, who some of you might know, Adam Yates, in the middle, and myself. And just knowing that you can have fun and do science at the same time was really, really important. And of course, my parents continued to be my biggest supporters. So that's after my defense at Western, you drink from the goblet of knowledge when you're done. So of course, they were there and very supportive and very happy. I did my postdoc at the University of Waterloo, where I did not study fish. And so that was from 2011 to 2014. And I actually was sitting in an office at the Ministry of Environment in Toronto, but the postdoc is technically through the University of Waterloo. And I studied here the long-term trends in water quality using the provincial water quality monitoring data. And this really is what led to the entire rest of my career, was making this shift over into water quality. So it appealed to me because it was advertised as being in agricultural watersheds, which is what I had always worked in, but it was a shift away from fish and bugs and into water quality. So we had, this great finding that total phosphorus concentrations are declining, which, what is the impact on harmful algal blooms? And now, I literally talk about harmful algal blooms and phosphorus all day, every day. I also attempted Twitter during my postdoc. This is when I got my handle at Riley T. Cat. Riley was my cat. And I proceeded to tweet as my cat for the next 10, 12 years. And it took me a little while to figure Twitter out, and then got the hang of it. And now who knows what Twitter's up to. Attending a lot of conferences during my postdoc. And actually, I was finding I was introducing my supervisors to people because I had grown my own network so large. And I was recalling recently at a time when I was at a conference and I managed to get all these different people together and go to different places. And I was like, man, I don't know how I just made that happen. And one of my colleagues said this beautiful thing to me that stuck with me. He said, you just be yourself and let it shine. So I thought that was just something that really stuck for me. And then in 2014, I started at the Conservation Authority, which is, I'm back home where Windsor is, and my dad was not well. So it was good for me to be able to come home and do the work that I wanted to be doing. There couldn't have been a more tailor-made job description when I read it. So I was very excited to be able to come home. But it was a shift, right? So I'd been in academia all this time. I knew I didn't want to be in academia. I don't have the publisher perish kind of idea. I haven't published that many papers. I've got one paper out of each of my degrees. So I knew ending up in academia wasn't exactly where I wanted to be, but I also don't know a ton about policy. So trying to figure out how to walk that line and how to do that communication in between those two different ivory towers. And they let me touch some fish for a little while, but that was a tease because I don't actually get to do much with fish anymore. So in terms of communicating, I would say this job is where I went from having imposter syndrome to being an imposter syndrome survivor and having that understanding. And I feel like we as academics, we all go through imposter syndrome, whether we admit to it or not. And you kind of have to, because you are learning and you are amongst the people that have been there for a lot longer than you have, and you are earning your place there. And once you have earned your place there, that is your place. And you now are the subject area. You're the subject, you're the master of your subject, and you deserve to be at the tables that you're sitting at. So this is the space where I learned that and kind of was able to overcome that, and I no longer really feel like I have imposter syndrome. I accept any and all invitations to speak. A lot of that with IRCA is with the youth, so doing high school specialist high school major programs, doing public interest groups. Speaking to lifelong learners is super fun. This is a group called Unicom that wanted to learn more about phosphorus and algal blooms. My grandma wanted me to come and speak to her Free on Friday group at the church, and she's 92 at the time. There were 72 people in that room, and they still talk about that presentation and just how exciting it was to learn from somebody who is, that I grew up there and was back and speaking to them about a subject that they were interested in. I really got the hang of Twitter as well, and I somehow became in the top 500 of the Great Lakes influencers, which was pretty cool. I really don't know what to do with Twitter currently. I don't seem to have the same reach, and no one seems to be using it the same way that they were, so we all have to sort of flux and change with that. And I realized and accepted that I am not a research scientist, and that's okay. My job is to listen to research scientists and to distill out the information that I'm learning from research scientists and to communicate that to other groups. So really recognizing what my strengths are and working with those. And of course, my mom continues to be my greatest supporter. And sometimes she is the only person in the room. And if she had known that this was happening, she would have probably been at this presentation too. So she's often comes with me to my presentations and is always eager and excited to learn. So I don't give as many conference presentations anymore because I don't do the science work, but I now co-chair sessions and events and just find other ways to be involved at conferences. Joining committees and somehow becoming the co-chair, even if I don't know what I'm doing. So I've found myself the co-chair of several committees. Often I'm the Canadian co-chair, and that's often because I'm the only Canadian at the table. But I really enjoy doing that, and that's really also helped me to grow my network. I encourage you to speak up, ask the weird questions, toss out your half-baked ideas. Sometimes when you're sitting in a room and people are kind of afraid to start talking, I will just say the most ridiculous thing that's obviously not the direction we're going to go in, but it starts a conversation and gets other people talking and having ideas. Know that when you talk to the media, no matter how many smart things you say, they are going to quote the absolute silliest thing that you said while you were talking to them. So things like the Leamington tributaries are a blob on the map. It didn't smell very good, said Dr. Katie Stammler in talking about harmful algal blooms. Or this is possibly the best thing I've ever done, which became the title of the podcast I did for Teach Me About the Great Lakes. So some highlights for me have been doing invited presentations and sitting on panels where I still sometimes, even though I don't feel like I have imposter syndrome, I'm still like, whoa, who, me? Like Dr. Stammler? That's this lady? Okay, that's crazy. Recently I did this really neat IJC greenhouse bus tour where I had all of the IJC commissioners on a bus and I took them on a tour of Essex County, had a microphone at the front of the bus and pointing out how we do different types of agriculture and taking them around and showing them the greenhouse growth in Leamington. I shared a stage with David Suzuki very early on in my time at the Conservation Authority, and he actually didn't know very much about harmful algal blooms. So in the lunchtime that we had before, I was actually teaching David Suzuki about harmful algal blooms, which was wild. Last year, I did a TV session on TVO about harmful algal blooms, which was really cool. And then truly a highlight for me was this past year, I did a podcast for Teach Me About the Great Lakes that was recorded at IAGLR. I'm wearing all my Genfish stuff. It was a little bit chilly. They made fun of me because I was the only Canadian out there and I was cold and they were not. But it really was just a lot of fun doing that. So everything came full circle for me coming back to the University of Windsor. I got my adjunct role at GLEAR. This allows me to do guest seminars and lectures, which I think are really cool. And then also becoming a committee member for graduate students, which I absolutely love doing. My first graduate student, Jess, when she graduated, it was a success for both of us that we got there and had that successful defense. And then Emily Varga, about a year ago, she emailed her committee and she said, so what do you want me to study for comps? And I legitimately had to step back and go, holy crap, I have to be the examiner at that table. And I hadn't even given that any thought. So, as you can see, Emily and I are both very happy that we made it through her comps. And that was a really cool experience. And then, of course, this year I decided to try out being a sessional lecturer. Back on my old stomping grounds. I'm teaching out of Assumption College, which is really cool. And just it's an interesting experience, right? And spending all that time preparing lectures, and then they fly by, and you hope you did a good enough job teaching them the material that you want them to learn. And it's been a great experience so far, and I can really see looking out at the students. Some of them are really zoned in and dialed in and getting something out of the class, and that you're making a difference in at least a handful of those lives. So that's really cool. So some final thoughts on communicating, be yourself and let it shine. Learn your material from multiple perspectives. Be clear in your messages. Use plain language as much as you can. graphs and graphics are helpful, but always make sure you're explaining them fully. You might get somebody lost in the stats and stuff. So just, what is the message you're trying to get across in that graph? Meet your audience where they are. Go to where the farmers are. Farmers are on Twitter, but also going to the events that they already have. So, farmers are one of my bigger audiences. Going to those lifelong learners, meeting them where they are, using the language that is familiar to them. Using multiple platforms to reach your broad audience, taking feedback and making adjustments as you go, and most importantly, having fun. And those are all of my slides, so I will stop sharing. I haven't been able to see any of you guys, so there, I'm back.
That was great, Katie. Thank you so much. And I love your sign holding up saying grade 28.
I actually did the math.
That's really, really good. I'd love to turn this over now to our audience, if our audience has any questions. But before we do, I wanted to thank you for that amazing talk. Again, just looking and knowing about your journey through science. And it's not necessarily like, I said this before with Dr. April Croxton, it's not so much as like, I did this here, I did that there, but it was your experiences behind it. It was your journey through it and what you learned and your setbacks, your barriers, how you were feeling and how you overcame it. It's that look behind the curtain, which I think is often lacking, instead of always showing, this was the amazing results I got. This is how I moved science forward. But our notion of, I think, what research excellence is changing. And even though you're like, I don't do the research or the science anymore, you're still so heavily involved in your research excellence, and the excellence you're doing in your field is incomparable. So I just wanted to put it out there. Okay, enough of me talking. I want to hear if anyone else has any questions or comments for Katie. Open the floor. I saw Kristen's hand go up.